Welcome to the Cubs Weekly Podcast presented by Wintrust, proud legacy partner of the Chicago Cubs, an exclusive home of Cubs checking. Open online today at wintrust.com/Cubs Weekly. As a reminder, we're available on all podcast platforms, so please be sure to rate and subscribe. I'm Andy Martínez, joined here by Lance Brozdowski, player development analyst for Marquee Sports Network, and Cubs VP of Scouting, Dan Kantrovitz. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. And I guess I got to start. Have you gotten any sleep as of late yet?
Not yet. The plan is to always, relax right after the draft, and it never works out that way. And after 20 years in this business, I should know better than to think that the day after the draft is going to be restful. But there's always stuff, whether it's negotiations, whether it's a hiccup here or there, that just comes up that makes it so. It'll probably be pretty hectic up until the signing deadline, is my guess.
What's your caffeine intake on draft day?
It's pretty substantial. Probably I'm too embarrassed to say sort of how high it is. I think it's just one of those things that I probably don't even feel it at that point. I've had so much in me the last few weeks. But
is it coffee or Red Bull, or what's the? You don't have to tell us the quantity.
Yeah, I try to stick with just normal coffee. Once I start getting into the energy drinks, then I start losing track of how many I've had, and then who knows what happens from there.
All right, Dan. Well, let's get into it. Let's get into this draft. I guess your initial reactions just on the draft as a whole, and kind of some of the picks you made. It was a busy day with a lot of college heavy picks that you guys made over the 3 days.
Yeah, I think going into it, and people are always asking me about the narrative or the theme of it. Is it pitcher heavy? Is it hitter heavy? Is it college heavy? High school heavy? I think that in terms of demographics, the high school versus college kind of takes care of itself in terms of the signability of players. You have to end up buying out a high school player of his college commitment, which generally requires a bit more of a signing bonus up front. And if you're a team that has a bottom third pool, which was us this year going into it, you're not gonna plan on drafting and signing too many high school players. To my pleasant surprise this year, I think we ended up being in play and drafting a couple more than I would have initially expected, which is positive. And then when it comes down to the hitting versus pitching dynamic, obviously last year it was heavily skewed towards the pitching end of things. And this year I think it was a bit more balanced. I think it's just one of those things going in where you try to have some rough guardrails to make sure you don't sort of skew too far in one direction, a direction you don't want to go into. And this year I think it was just pretty balanced and probably a more sustainable type of model going forward. Last year just so happened that we had so many spots where we needed some arms. We needed people to take some innings, and then now I think we're getting to more of that steady state in PD where it should start at somewhere near a 50-50 mix, hitters, pitchers, and then from there you just kind of react to what the strength of the draft is and who ends up getting to you at each pick.
Was there anything in the draft as a whole, maybe just among how other teams drafted, that stood out to you in terms of trends that maybe you didn't expect?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lance. And, I think every year that's one of my favorite things to do is to really just scrub sort of what each team is doing. And I think until we sort of get past the signing deadline and see sort of who signed who, it's tough to really make heads or tails of that just yet. Because, some teams, especially on day 3, are drafting first round talents and, say the 15th or 16th round. And, on occasion they might end up signing them. But I think in general, there's quite a few of those guys that end up going unsigned and either going back to school or going to college. So at this point, I think it's a little early for me to weigh in on that, though I do think that's kind of a fascinating component that is always in your mind as the draft's unfolding. And, when certain teams are kind of going in this direction, it starts to add up. But, I think if, I don't want to get too distracted on that, the heat of the moment during the draft and kind of lose track of what we're trying to do. But we're human. So you end up kind of going, oh, that team, ended up doing this, or that team seems to be sort of having that strategy. But I think that's something that we'll probably be reviewing in more detail over the next few days.
You mentioned what you guys were doing. First pick, 13th overall, you guys take Matt Shaw out of Maryland. Well, I guess what stood out to him primarily, it seemed like that the hit tool, the offensive profile was pretty good and had some success in the Cape Cod League and obviously at Maryland.
Yeah, it's always nice when the track record of a player, his performance resume sort of jives with what our scouts are saying. There's cases where a player will have, really outstanding performance like Matt has had, and maybe our scouts are, a little less optimistic on sort of that hit tool, for example, or power tool, or maybe it's vice versa, where our scouts are really optimistic about a player's hit and power tool, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't, he hasn't performed and really put it into practice. But Matt's a guy that kind of combines both. I mean, he's got that impressive resume performance. Our scouts were saying the same thing about his hit tool, his power tool, his ability to control the zone. So we're pretty excited about his bat. I mean, I think if you look at some of the some of the clips of him hitting this year, you can just see sort of how dynamic of a swing it is. How quick his hands are, how strong they are. He's really optimizing, I think, the leverage in his swing and just every ounce of strength he has. And then you combine that with somebody that is sort of a top-notch work ethic, which we're pretty impressed with and convinced that it is among sort of some of the best we've seen. I think that just lends itself to somebody that's going to come in, hopefully have some success, and then also be open to some of our instruction from our hitting guys who are among the best in the game. And then defensively, I think it's something where we're probably going to have to just let that play out a bit. He's versatile. He can run. He can go get the ball. His hands are fighting, he can catch. His feet work. His arm works from a few different spots in the infield. And so we're gonna have to see where kind of the best fit is there. But I think I'd have to imagine that he probably starts at shortstop and then sort of goes either to second or third, and then we'll kind of see where we are in a couple of years.
Each of the last two drafts, it seems like you have relied heavily on Billy Swoop's region and Ty Nichols in terms of focusing on those guys, those recs from those individual scouts. Can you talk about, how big of an influence veteran scouts have in like a draft room like yours in terms of influence? And I can't imagine it's intentional, so I imagine it's more circumstantial, like that lined up. But just talk about, I guess, the influence that legacy scouts, so to speak, have in draft rooms.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours about Billy, Ty. There's a few others I'd put into that mix, whether it's Ralph down in Florida. It's just one of those things where starting really just in the scouting process. I mean, the influence they have on our other scouts and helping to develop sort of our younger scouts. Being a sounding board for me, being a confidant for me throughout the spring, and just really just respecting and trying to tap into their experience. I mean, all you have to do is just go sit at a game with them, and you can just it just is so clear and impressive how much time they've spent in this game around players, around coaches, and you just try to kind of be a sponge when you're around those guys. And it's like you said, Lance, it's not intentional during the draft where we end up drafting quite a few guys from Billy's area, but at the same time, I don't think it's coincidental. I think it's one of those things where Billy really knows how to put us in position to draft and then sign a player. And those are two very distinct processes. And, I think that's one of the, that's something that younger scouts, it takes some time to learn. You can nail the evaluation, you can get the right people in to see the player. But then there's sort of another component, which is, not just the drafting and eval part, but really just putting us in position to sign that player. And a lot of that's cultivating relationships with the players, the coaches, their families, sort of knowing sort of the right angles, knowing really just how to do that in the most effective way. And that takes time too. And so I think because it takes time to really just establish some of those relationships, it ends up kind of going hand in hand with sort of our more veteran scouts, end up probably, all things being equal, having a bit more, success in the draft, if you will.
And you mentioned an interesting point, like with the player development, but in Shaw's case, you guys have had some track record with drafting and developing college hitters, especially advanced college hitters like him. Does that play a huge factor? Like if you're close between a couple guys, or is it really just, we like him a lot, we're going to take him regardless of what our PD says per se. Like how much does that play a role specifically in Shaw's case this year?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think increasingly in our game, I think PD, you need to leverage the strengths and the capabilities and the resources of whether it's player development, whether it's strength and conditioning, whether it's research and development. And, that tends to take center stage, and even on the day of the draft, where, we might have a conference call with the player that we're considering drafting, sometimes even up until like an hour before the draft is literally going to start, and we'll have a Zoom call, for example, with maybe myself, and if it's on the hitting end, like Stoney and maybe one of the folks in his department, and then maybe somebody on our R&D side to sort of walk a player through like an individualized player plan, explain to them sort of how we think we can optimize their skill set, where we think there's potential to unlock value, and players are really thirsty for that kind of knowledge now, because it's they're getting exposed to it. Sometimes it's some of these really advanced college setups, but more than anything, they just know that they're really motivated to just become the best versions of themselves. And if we have information that can help them do that, they're really receptive to it in most cases. And I think it really helps us when we have to put on sort of a recruiting hat, and if there's a difference in sort of how much maybe signing bonus pool we have left. Sometimes that can kind of tip the scales in our favor if we were able to show a player, what resources we have, and convince them that we can sort of, optimize them and develop them better than anybody else. So it's something that really comes into play probably with every single pick. And, not to mention, we try to leverage the opinions of, what they think from just a straight evaluation standpoint, whether it's our coaches reviewing video throughout the spring, because probably after a week or so in our system, our coaches are going to end up knowing these players better than we as scouts probably did over the last few years. That's just sort of the nature of the beast. And, we can try to, have get to know them as best as we can, but, until you really get them sort of into the system and, sit down and talk with them, for a few hours, at our complex in Mesa, and just kind of go through the framework of like an orientation and an onboarding. You really don't know them as well as what our player development coaches will, just a couple of days into it. So yeah, it's a really important part of the process.
Jackson Wiggins is your guys' second-round pick, right-handed pitcher out of Arkansas, who went down with Tommy John earlier this year. I imagine anyone who's maybe following the draft as a fan is probably a bit surprised you guys took a player who hasn't thrown since February and probably won't throw maybe off the mound until later this year, depending on his rehab process. But can you talk about what you guys saw potentially in 2022, and obviously the work you'd done prior to that gave you confidence in him post-TJ?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think UCL reconstruction or Tommy John surgery is becoming a reality in our game, and it's just something that you can't really be afraid of it in terms of from a draft perspective, and players that sort of are going through that. You just have to make sure that we have a firm grasp of how long it's going to be, what their ramp up is going to be, where they are in their rehab, making sure that our doctors reviewed the surgery notes to make sure that everything went according to plan there. But I think at the same time, when you see a premier talent, and it's you're able to weigh that timeline of his recovery and when he's going to be able to get back in post again. I think that's something that you just have to just weigh into the equation, but you don't want to walk away from what we think is potentially a premier talent and a top of the rotation arm. We saw him. We've had history on Jackson ever since he stepped foot on our on campus at Arkansas, and Ty Nichols, our area scout, even has history beyond that. But I think what really sort of got us from this first of all, the thing that jumps off the page of Jackson is that he's a deluxe physical specimen and a deluxe athlete. He's explosive. I was talking to him yesterday, and we were kind of having a laugh about some of his high school basketball highlights. He's just it's such a smooth but yet explosive athleticism that he has. But then on the mound, I think he stepped at Arkansas his freshman year. He was a high leverage back end reliever for him, just throwing gas out of the pen and really just relying on just that upper 90s sink or upper 90s heater with that slider. And then I think as time progressed, he ended up becoming more of a complete pitcher, and they moved him into their rotation the next year, and started to see him use his changeup a little bit more, started to see him split the plate with his fastball, started to see him have a little bit better command with his slider. And then he was just sort of on the upward trajectory all spring, this being his sophomore year. And then that culminated with, we saw him in Omaha the same year that we saw Cade Horton there. And, he started to break out this more vertical curveball. And, I remember texting a few of our guys and saying, I don't remember seeing this before. And, I think he tried it, he mixed it in occasionally, but it wasn't until the College World Series where it just became just a really impressive part of his mix. And you combine that vertical break with some of the other components of his other pitches, and it becomes a pretty fascinating mix, and one that we're pretty excited about. So I think the sky's the limit for Jackson, and it's there's just all the ingredients that we look for there, and hopefully complete the signing process here shortly.
You mentioned an interesting point right now, and you mentioned it earlier in the draft when talking about Jackson, that like he's a really athletic guy, really freak of an athlete. You mentioned his basketball skills. For like the common fan who, he sees maybe just the stat line, right? He sees what he did at Arkansas, and he doesn't like dive into it. Why is that athleticism so important, and why do you feel like you can do so much more with someone who is as athletic as Jackson is?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think there's two parts to that. There's one which is like the baseball card stats, if they stand out to people or if they don't. But then there's more sort of, I think, predictive underlying metrics that you can get into. Whether it's expected outcomes, whether it's just the pitch shapes, where we try to look beyond just baseball card stats and try to figure out really what's this guy's ceiling. But I think from the standpoint of Jackson, it's just we see somebody where there's some opportunity to refine some of his pitch shapes, and I think you want to get to a point where those baseball card stats start to end up being more impressive than they probably were his freshman year. But I don't think they were. I still think they were pretty solid, by any measure. So he's on that real, just I think, upward trajectory of somebody that's improving rapidly. And I think in some ways, I think the rest that he's sort of had to go through, having had UCL reconstruction surgery, is that his body's still developing too. When you have that kind of frame, I mean, he's still putting on weight naturally, as well as working really hard in the weight room. So I think he's going to come out of this process looking a little bit different than he did going in a really positive way. But he's a special person. I think he's a pretty special human being, in addition to just the tools on the field. And we're pretty excited to try to get him in the fold here shortly.
Jumping over to the third round and some of the subsequent picks, I'll just write through them for people who don't know. But Josh Rivera, shortstop of Florida, was number 81 overall in the third round. Will Sanders, pitcher out of South Carolina, fourth round. Fifth round, Michael Carrizo, a catcher from Davidson. Alfonsine Rosario in the sixth round, and then Yahil Melendez, two high school kids in the sixth and seventh round. Is there a particular tool in that mix that you're most excited to have in the system?
I think the first thing that comes to mind when you start rattling off that list, Lance, is our second year area scout Melendez in South Carolina actually was the signing scout. Will be the signing scout for Sanders, as well as Fonzie Rosario, and she just did a phenomenal job all spring of getting to know these guys really well, getting to know their families, their support systems, what makes them tick, how passionate they are, their makeup. So I'd be remiss if I didn't, mention her right off the bat when you start to rattle those names, because she was just instrumental in our draft this year, and it was very impressive work that she did on both fronts. But in terms of the tools, I'll stick with Rosario. I mean, he was at our pre-draft workout in Myrtle Beach, and we wanted to get just a better feel for sort of what this toolsy type of player. And I mean, he's hitting balls off the scoreboard like you don't see somebody typically at that age, especially in that ballpark. And I mean, there's some real raw power in there. And we're gonna have to refine his approach, and his bat to ball skills are gonna have to develop a little bit. But when it comes to tools, he can run and he can throw, but the raw power there is a pretty special carry tool.
I think Carrizo, the catcher, I mean, he had like a insane OBP, right? Like almost near 600. Like what stands out as a him? Like how confident are you guys that he could stick at catcher and kind of be that rare offensive and defensive catcher?
Yeah, I think we're really optimistic that he can stick there, and we're going to give him every chance to do that. And we think that's a big part of the value proposition and his overall game. And he obviously has got borderline elite bat to ball skills, and then couple that with with some strength and some leverage in his approach, and he can drive the yard to all fields. And more than anything, just has I think just a really advanced awareness of the strike zone and can control the strike zone enough to enable his bat and power to eventually play. So he's somebody that we've been pretty excited about, and he got a little banged up as the season went on, and then ended up coming home from the CADE just to kind of rest and get ready for the draft, which isn't unusual. But I think we'll probably take our time, kind of getting him ramped up and started again, just after kind of being a little bit banged up here down the stretch. But defensively, I mean, he's a really good athlete, and so I think he's really agile back there, really flexible. We think he's got enough arm strength to maintain the position at least initially, and then hopefully everything kind of develops across the board as his body develops, as he matures. But there's no reason to think that he's not going to be able to maintain that position at this point. And couple that with a bat that's got both power and contact ability, and it ends up being what could be a pretty valuable package.
Your guy's 16th round pick, I'm going deep here, is Daniel Brown, a pitcher at a lefty at Campbell University. He is a guy that I think is up to like 101, 102, and he had a bit of a walks and hit by pitch problem. There's maybe not a ton of feel for pitching there, but I imagine as you get later into the draft, you start to maybe focus in on an individual tool like his. Lefty velocity is obviously rare, and maybe look past some of the potential flaws in the profile. But can you talk about that and how later in drafts it's maybe not so much of looking for a complete package, but looking for a tool that you guys can kind of compound with the PD department?
Yeah, I think he's a really interesting case. And Lance, you just summed it up really well in terms of sort of our approach, later in the draft, and kind of, being a little bit more flexible, if you will, with sort of our mindset, and not just saying, well, this guy, didn't have very good performance, and then realizing it was, just a total of one inning basically this year. And there's not every day you come across a kid that has the can get up to 102 with that kind of electricity in his arm stroke and can spin the ball the way he does, and is just athletic. And the more we got to know him, the more we became confident that he's just he's a really smart kid, and he wants to learn, and he wants to improve, and he's just got a thirst for knowledge. And we figured that if this is a case where maybe he just hasn't been exposed to the resources and the instruction from a pitching standpoint, and maybe sports, maybe a question of opportunity, and maybe he hasn't gotten that there. And when you get find a guy with those sort of raw tools to start, you realize that it's going to take some patience, it's going to take some time, and there's no certainty or on the other end. But I think it's if anybody can kind of help him along, it's it'd be a combination of how impressive of a person he is, and how his willingness to improve, but combine that with our pitching infrastructure. I think it could be a pretty exciting guy in a few years.
I want to go a little. I won't go as deep as Lance, but Yahil Melendez was an interesting guy out of Puerto Rico, and someone that I know you mentioned. You guys got a lot of looks at him, which isn't common for guys that are coming out of Puerto Rico. What you guys like about him, and what kind of excites you the most out of him?
Yeah, I think one of our strengths when I look across our scouting department is our coverage of Puerto Rico relative to other teams. Edward Guzman does a phenomenal job sort of manning that area, and just sort of keeping a pulse and knowing what's going on, knowing who the best players are. And then more than anything, I think he makes sure that we have a wave, it's usually about 3 different waves that we try to get in there with our senior evaluators throughout the spring. And I think we're just in a really good position come draft day to have as much information as you can possibly have on players coming out of Puerto Rico, thanks to Guzzi. And then Yahil was somebody that had a Rice commitment, and so he wasn't like he was kind of an unknown down there. He's been sort of a famous guy over the last couple of years, and he's somebody that our scouts really liked. And when we got to that point in the draft, all of our reports were probably at least 2 or 3 rounds higher than kind of where we ended up taking him, which is what you ideally want to happen. But he's somebody that we think has a chance to stay at shortstop. He's still growing to his frame. He's a young kid. But there's some, different back to ball skills there that we don't see all the time out of kids coming out of Puerto Rico, just younger kids. And so we think there's, once he starts to mature physically and, get under the umbrella of our hitting infrastructure, that, he might be able to really hit as, the years unfold here.
How much do prior picks help you inform kind of future decisions? Jumping back to last year, you guys took Cade Horton in the first round, Jackson Ferris in the second round. Ferris lefty in Myrtle. Cade Horton's been dominating South Bend. Prior year, Jordan Wicks out of Kansas State's another lefty, kind of more field change-up based guy. He's also developed really well. He's all the way up to AAA. Looking at those guys' progression, is there anything you kind of take away from that and apply to this draft?
Yeah, I mean, I think the once you've been doing this, for 15, 20 years, you end up sort of falling back and looking at a lot of the mistakes you've made. At least that's at least what I try to do in my position, and where you were off from an evaluation standpoint, where you were off from just a value standpoint. So was that a scouting error? Was that a decision making error? How can you sort of learn from that going forward? And I think when you look at just kind of the more recent cases, it's hard to if it's just a year or two out, hard to sort of really extract one thing or another in terms of like, what you might have done wrong, what you might have done right. But I mean, I think, it's the drafts that I've been a part of, 10, 15 years ago where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Or I want to make sure to be cognizant of this so that, we improve, the process, in whether it's scouting or decision making, going forward. But I think, it's something where, that just by virtue of Cade and Jordan being, profiling as probably starting pitchers for us in the big leagues, which is a bold statement in itself. I think that's something that, we're optimistic and excited about. But, you also want to be a little bit guarded and cautious there where, you're talking about drafts 1 to 2 years out. But I think at this point, it looks like, maybe that those would be processes that we'd look to kind of repeat going forward, because it's early returns have been really strong from both those guys, which is exciting.
I want to dive in a little bit more on Cade, because I remember when he was taken last year, it was almost a little bit of surprise to the outside, right? Like he wasn't I think, I can't remember if you guys were picking 8 or around that area. He wasn't necessarily like the 8th best prospect or anything like that, and it was kind of a surprise. But when you look at, as you mentioned, the returns, the early returns, it seems like you hit that one out of the park. What has stood out to you in his first year in pro ball, and are you any surprised at what he's kind of been able to do?
Yeah, I mean, the development path is never linear. It's never the same for each player. We talk about like Daniel Brown, where he's not as young as a high school player, but still might be pretty early on his development curve. So sometimes it's about age, sometimes it's not. But I think a guy like Cade, it's like he came in with a little bit fewer innings under his belt than probably his his other college arms that we were comparing him to. But I think from very early on in the spring, we evaluated him as a first round talent, and I think you don't want to get too wrapped up in. You want to make sure that you're just not operating in a vacuum, independent of what anybody else thinks or says about players, and that you're not. But at the same time, if realizing that, like at the time, Cade might have seemed like a bit of a surprise externally. I don't. If he's the guy that we think is has that kind of talent, we don't want to just sort of stay away from it or move on just because it's going to be a surprise on draft day. I mean, we at the end of the day need to fall back on how we line these guys up, be confident in that, and kind of stay true to our process. And we didn't. You can never be entirely sure sort of how a player is going to turn out when you draft them. And there's always hiccups, bumps in the road, things that you'll encounter that you don't expect. But from a standpoint of how much information we had at the time and how confident we were in our evaluation looks at Cade, I mean, we were, as confident as it gets from that standpoint. So it's just really nice to see him go out there and do what he's doing. And, I know there are, some people that weren't quite as familiar with his work, going to the draft, which was clear sort of after the post draft. But I think at this point, just kind of the proof's in the pudding, and you look at just how he's dominating hitters, at every level, and we're still looking for ways to challenge him. And when you're in that position, still looking for ways to challenge, kid, that's a pretty good indicator that there's some ceiling there.
And you mentioned challenging a kid, Jordan Wicks. He's kind of succeeded at every level. What have you thought of his progression, and how exciting is it to see him in AAA, one step away from the majors?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all pretty happy with Jordan's progression up to this point. And when you get somebody that profiles as just a starting pitcher in the big leagues, and that's a fingernail away from that right now in AAA, and probably could compete up there right now, that ends up being a pretty valuable asset for us. And it's not surprising to us in that sense. I mean, we, similar to Cade, we had Jordan evaluated pretty high going into the draft, and thought that there's if everything worked out, that there would be a good chance that he'd be a starting pitcher for us at some point here in the big leagues. And I hope we get to see that here at some point soon.
Absolutely. Can we end this on a more, I guess, fun note, so to speak? Justin Steele, homegrown lefty for you guys.
Yeah.
In the All-Star game, obviously, that I imagine is a huge kind of badge of pride for the organization, especially given what the general media consensus has been, I'd say, since maybe the mid-2000s in regards to developing pitching. I imagine you guys were all really hyped to see that, but just give us a little nugget maybe from other people in the org about how happy you guys were.
Yeah, it's a source of pride, like you said, Lance, for all of our scouts and development folks that were part of that process. He was drafted before I got here, but still can have pride in sort of what he's doing, and really appreciate and get excited about it. And I remember talking with Scotty and Ben, two folks who I work closely with in the office, who do an excellent job kind of helping me run our department, and going into our Southeast pre-draft scouting meetings. And we started to talk to players. That's kind of where we run down the list and try to line the guys up going into the draft. That was a few weeks ago. And I remember, mentioning to one of our Southeast regional cross-checker, Bobby Filati, we were talking about a left-handed high school kid. And, I think Bobby, if I'm not mistaken, might have been one of the, early scouts to kind of plant the flag on Justin back in high school. And, just kind of ring the bell and say, this guy's pretty good, among many others who were part of that process. So, I mean, it's just something that, goes a long way, even, still, and probably will be somebody that our scouts will be really proud as they should be, for years to come. So stories like that, definitely motivate us. It motivates scouts to sort of, drive that extra hour to try to, unturn this rock and go see this player in a certain area. It's what motivates, us to get extra looks on guys like Jordan Wicks and Cade Horton, and not give up on those guys in the scouting process. And but yeah, I think more than anything, it's just a real source of pride for our department, for the organization, and for everybody that was a part of that process.
Dan, thanks so much for taking some time out of I know this is a busy week for you, so thank you for taking some time with us, and go get some coffee, go get some sleep. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Lance. Take care, guys.
Get your Wintrust exclusive debit card. Get your Cubs card.
Ooh, I'll take one. How much?
Actually, they pay you $300. You heard right. Get a $300 bonus when you open a Cubs checking account with Wintrust. Enjoy all perks and purchase with pride every time with your Wintrust Cubs debit card.
Wait,
$300?
what?
I'll take a card.
$300? Get your exclusive card at wintrust.com/Cubs. Only $100 required to open. No monthly minimum balance and no monthly maintenance fees. Member FDIC and equal housing lender.
Welcome back to the Cubs Weekly Podcast. Lance Brozdowski, player development analyst at Marquee Sports Network, and Andy Martinez here. Lance, I guess we talked to Dan. He gave us the rundown on the draft. What were your takeaways from kind of what the Cubs did in the 2023 draft?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I like looking at the split of basically 17, I think, college guys versus 3 high school. That I think is pretty indicative of maybe what they thought the strengths of this draft was compared to prior drafts. Pretty evenly split between pitchers and hitters too. I think that was the key thing that I thought was interesting from what we just heard from Dan, was that he thought that maybe in prior years they needed some more arms just in the system to fill innings. And then this year it kind of balanced back out. So I imagine going forward, it'll be kind of more balanced, which gives them kind of the optionality to potentially go hitter or pitcher, whoever's best available on the board. Or maybe in prior years, they were probably trying to, I don't want to say force a pitcher or two, but get those guys in there. And Cade and Jackson Ferris is a pretty good example of that. That's probably my main takeaway. But yeah, Matt Shaw's high floor, and then you see Jackson Wiggins second round is like huge variance, I think, and in what he could become, whether it's Penn, post TJ. We probably need a year or two before we kind of get a really good read on him. and then it goes back to college, then it flows back to some high school talent that they really like in Rosario and Melendez in the 6th and 7th round. So you kind of end up with like an ebb and flow of the draft that tells a pretty good story of what they were trying to do. That's probably my main takeaway, though, is that they seem to believe they have arms in the system now such that they want to bounce it back out and just kind of go with a split of 11 pitchers to 9 hitters or reverse that number, which I thought is pretty balanced. It's good to see.
And it was another interesting point that Dan mentioned too, was with high school guys. So they were in the lower third in terms of bonus pool money that they can give out in draft signing. That was another interesting point, right? Like with high school guys, unless it's like a Jackson Holiday or like a can't miss prospect like that, usually you kind of have to overpay per se because they have the option to go to college. They kind of have that security built in. So that's another interesting point, right? Where if you're in the lower third of bonus pool, you can't spend that extra money per se to buy someone out of a commitment to college. So the college is more, I want to say, like safer bet or like a safety net that you can kind of rely on. And it's interesting too with some of the guys that they're taking. If you look at the colleges, right, like Maryland, South Carolina, Florida, like these are big time programs. There's a player drafted from Vanderbilt later on in the draft. Like these are big time programs that have facilities that you could argue are on par with major league facilities, right? In terms of research and development, in terms of player development, in terms of just like pure facilities to be able to develop players that you have a really good idea of what a player is. It's not like 20, 30 years ago where you're like, well, this guy hits a ton of home runs. Like that's who he is. You have the data to back it up. And that's something that Dan mentioned that I thought was interesting, right? Like the scouts can see and find tools in players, but then they have the data from all these schools that are so advanced nowadays that it can kind of act as a background check or as a safety net too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data is huge. I mean, they're pretty integrated between, I imagine, the R&D backing up what scouts think, and they obviously have some scouts driving the ship. I think more so than others, as we heard. They've had Billy Swoop from his particular region, and Ty Nichols from the Midwest in terms of a lot of the pitching that he's been on the last couple of years. So that's always fascinating to me to see the integration between departments. I think some of the smarter orgs in baseball that draft well and develop well are really, really well integrated between what, the player development side thinks that they could develop easier and then what the draft actually targets to supplant and kind of allow those guys to progress quicker.
Yeah, Lance, we want to wrap up. Obviously, we're recording Wednesday, day after the All-Star game. Justin Steele makes his All-Star game debut, first time in the All-Star game. Really, really cool moment for him, for the Cubs organization. We talked about it with Dan about this theory about not being able to develop pitching. We have a homegrown All-Star pitcher who's one of the better pitchers in baseball right now. So what was your takeaway from the All-Star game and seeing Steele in there?
It was great. I mean, he was incredibly every picture I saw, he was smiling, and it was great. Obviously, his son was there too, Bo, which was awesome to see. So I think just the emotional side for him was probably the coolest thing to me. Just seeing that emotion, first All-Star game, representing the Cubs, the only Cub actually at the All-Star game, given Dansby and Stroman taking some time off and stuff. So I love that. I mean, he has become the pseudo face of this team, so to speak, I think, in terms of performance and stability, especially in the rotation alongside Stroman. So it's just cool to see him there. He pitched an inning, 1 hit, 1 K, just clean overall, which was great to see. It was a blast. It was fun seeing him there, and I imagine you could tell the look on his face. He was pretty happy to be there too.
Yeah, I thought the cool thing was there was that awesome play by Austin Riley right at third base, and it was, I believe it was his second out, and he mentioned post game when he was talking about it, like they're a fellow Mississippian, right? Like they both were in Mississippi. They played on a high school All-Star team, and Justin Steele mentioned he was like the best hitter and pitcher on the team. So it was really cool to see that full circle moment, right, of two guys from Mississippi at the biggest stage in the All-Star game, and having that cool connection. I thought that was really cool and really fun to see. But just an overall really, really fun moment to see Justin Steele, someone who was way more than deserving of being an All-Star and to be honored and to pitch in the biggest moment. So I think, like you mentioned, like he's one of the better pitchers in baseball, but I also think there's a big portion of baseball that doesn't know who Justin Steele is, which I think is a shame, because if you watch him day in and day out, I mean, you see he's on par with some of these superstar aces. He's not blowing you away with stuff, but he's just as good in getting the out. So I think it was awesome to see Justin Steele kind of be on a national stage so more people get to know him. But that was my takeaway from it. Really, really fun. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens here as the second half starts on Friday with the Cubs taking on Boston. Make sure to tune into Marquee Sports Network. We'll have you guys covered on Cubs pregame live, Cubs postgame live. That'll do it for this edition of the Cubs Weekly Podcast presented by Wintrust. Don't forget to download and subscribe to the pod on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and check us out in video form on the Marquee Sports Network app and YouTube. For Lance, I'm Andy. Thanks for tuning in.